Welcome to Pax Britannica. The Great Defiance with Dr David Veevers. Today, I'm delighted to speak with Dr David Veevers, lecturer in early modern history at Bangor University. David has previously been on PAX to talk about his 2020 book, The Origins of the British Empire in Asia, 1600 to 1750. Today, he's here to discuss his brand new book, which comes out, if I've timed this interview release correctly, today, on the 25th of May, 2023. The book is The Great Defiance, How the World Took on the British Empire. And thanks to David and Penguin, I've been able to get my hands on a review copy. It's really good, and we only scratched the surface in this interview. There's a passage in the book's introduction which I think summarises the perspective which the Great Defiance takes. Dr. Veevers writes, "The defining event of the pre-modern world was not the emergence of an all-encompassing British Empire, but the great defiance of the people who found themselves in its path, and their heroic struggle in resisting it, often successfully. The English, and then, following England's union with Scotland in 1707, the British, were repeatedly frustrated by the power and resilience of the people and places they encountered." So, without further ado, we'll jump right in. Hello, David.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for inviting me on again to the wonderful podcast. Looking forward to it.
We'll start off with a fairly straightforward but complicated question. Why did you write The Great Defiance? What was it you were trying to address with this book?
You know, there's anyone listening to this that might remember my previous appearance. So my previous work was focused on Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Indian subcontinent, was looking at the expansion of the East India Company across the 17th and 18th century and sort of kind of challenging ideas about expansion as the East India Company's kind of relentless, successful rise at the expense of Asian societies and polities, and instead looked at the way in which actually they were quite resilient politically and economically, and they often absorbed Europeans and could often sort of enfranchise Europeans with rights and powers, but in a way that strengthened the Mughal Empire or the various sultanates of South India. And that it was a more complicated relationship where the two sort of essentially by the mid-18th century had come to rely on one another. And so it's a kind of different kind of an expansion kind of within and because of the power of Indian states and sultanates and empires. And so I was really interested in taking or following from that research and thinking far more widely, is this going on elsewhere in the pre-modern world? Or are the British, are they just coming in, conquering and running roughshod over everyone and transforming the environments around them, you know, without much opposition? And so, in a way, so it's taking that thread from that early research and being quite ambitious and thinking, well, I'll look at it across the world in the 250 years between the late 16th century through to the end of the 18th century. And so that's the kind of the main urge from a sort of academic point of view. As I was doing my research and my writing, I found that yes, absolutely, that what we really see is the heart of the English and later British Empire, the Atlantic, the North American colonies, the Caribbean, and places like Ireland, is that it is usually just a kind of narrative of, you know, relentless British success and colonisation. But my research was finding otherwise, and that actually that a lot of the indigenous political and economic structures proved far more resilient, and that it often took sometimes more than a century for the English to establish their hegemony and to subvert or to undermine the states and societies that it encountered. So and I thought, well, this in a way perhaps challenges very general narratives we have about the British Empire. That it came, it saw, it conquered, it refashioned the world in its image. Britain made the modern world. These are the sort of histories that still dominate the, you know, non-specialist public conversation around empire and its legacies as Britain being all conquering. And so I thought, well, this is a great opportunity then to maybe contribute to that conversation and maybe challenge some ideas the wider public might have about, non-Europeans being sort of very passive, inevitable victims of English success and European success. And so when I finished writing the book, instead of going down the traditional academic route and writing it for a university press, I thought, well, I could write this for an audience that maybe have an interest in history but aren't specialists in the British Empire. And it'd be a great introduction to an alternative narrative. Actually, the pre-modern world, it isn't the story of the rise of European empires. It's a far more complex story of resistance and as I would say, defiance, and ensuring that, what the British Empire ends up as at the end of the 18th century isn't necessarily the success, the successful realisation of ambitions in London or Paris or elsewhere, but actually it's more of a compromise between the very powerful and dynamic societies and empires and states that the British encountered and British ambition. So there's real compromise. And so, in many respects, the non-Europeans and indigenous people the British encounter shaped the British Empire as much as they were themselves shaped by their encounter with the British. And I thought that was a new, fresh take on the British Empire that I thought a wider audience might appreciate.
So let's talk about some of these acts of defiance that you're referring to. Now, obviously, you had to pick and choose. With an empire as big and as long-lasting as the British, you couldn't cover everything. So what did you choose to focus on?
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a roughly 250-year period. It's a long period of time. It's not a fully comprehensive history of British expansion, and therefore I had to be selective, as any historian is in their research and their writing or their publishing. And I thought, well, I wanted to, in a way, they're very traditional narratives of the British Empire. And when we anchor it from a British perspective, it becomes very sort of parochial. It had the struggle with the Spanish and Sir Francis Drake, the establishment of Jamestown and the conquest of Ireland, and then the opening up of the Indian Ocean and these sorts of very traditional stories and narratives. So I wanted to do a few things different. I wanted to look at perhaps episodes of resistance that were less known about, and areas for me also that, as a specialist on South Asia, that were new to me in researching and writing the book. Although I should say they're not new to historians. A lot of the flashpoints that I focus on have been well researched and established by historians, and I think that kind of in bringing them together, and flipping the perspective we take of the expansion, not from the British perspective, but from the perspective of non-Europeans and indigenous people, it tells an entirely different story. And so in kind of assembling those flashpoints of resistance and defiance, which sort of reshaped or even blunted and sometimes defeated entirely British expansion in those particular regions, I wanted to think about the uniqueness and the less well-known stories. And so difficult or challenges about writing it from that perspective without the British as your running narrative thread is that you've got a disparate number of examples that aren't really tied together so much. And so you have to find a way of linking these stories together in a narrative rather than sort of jumping all over the place with no apparent reason. So I began by looking at the areas that we associate with British success, as I said earlier, the Atlantic and those societies and states on the Atlantic Rim. And, supposedly this was the heart of the English Empire and the main area of colonization and conquest. But actually, within the Atlantic, there are surprising stories of indigenous success and endurance and resistance, often intergenerational over centuries, which slowed or blunted or contained entirely English ambition. So I thought about starting, and this is one of the things that, for me, it's a personal bugbear, and I know it is for colleagues in Ireland itself, but Ireland was the first English colony. And yet we often don't begin with Ireland in the history of the British Empire. Sometimes we don't even bring it into the story at all. One of the reasons why is because in the reign of Henry VIII, Ireland is turned into a kingdom of the English monarchy. And so we sort of push it into our domestic history, when that may have been the case sort of legally or in terms of sovereignty, but practicality on the ground, it's very much a colony. It's treated as a colony, and it's a colonial process. And Ireland becomes the kind of laboratory for English strategies of colonialism and atrocity that's then projected elsewhere in the Atlantic. So I thought starting with Ireland would be a great one. Ireland is our nearest neighbour. There's such a long history of violence and colonialism and conquest, and it's not one that you see often in curriculums nor even at universities. There's probably a handful of people teaching English colonialism in Ireland in the UK today. I think that was a really interesting one. It's a long history. England was lashing Ireland with Anglo-Norman colonists ever since the 12th, 13th century. And so this was going on for centuries, and it all sort of falls apart during, really the sort of Wars of the Roses, when a lot of the English nobles return to England to intervene in the struggle for power, and allows the indigenous Irish to recover and to reoccupy most of Ireland that's been over 3 centuries or so lost to English colonisation. And so they fence the English into what's known as the Pale, the Pale meaning fence, and it's a small kind of strip of territory in the east. And so when the Tudors established their dynasty in the late 16th century, they have to try and reconquer Ireland all over again. And so I wanted to show that, English colonialism has a long, deep history, especially in Ireland. And that was really interesting is that we're used to thinking of Ireland as very early on being kind of subsumed into English rule. But for most of the subsequent 16th century, England really struggles against some of the really powerful Irish lords. And even when they do succeed, and by the end of the century, much of Ireland has been occupied by England, even then, there's a kind of spectacular conflict, the 9 Years' War, under the Lord of Ulster, Earl of Tyrone, Hugh O'Neill. And he succeeds in uniting almost all of Ireland against the English, and almost succeeds in expelling the English from Ireland entirely. He inflicts the biggest English defeat in Ireland ever, the Battle of the Yellow Ford. 2,000 English troops are killed. And it's only after almost 10 years of conflict that Hugh O'Neill is contained. Only when the English crown commits the full resources of the English state, and it pushes the English state to the brink of collapse. And one of the great things about little known facts that if we think the way we treat the late 16th century, the Elizabethan period, is Spain and the intervention in the Netherlands, the Armada and all of that take kind of prime position, and Ireland is a colonial sideshow. But actually, in terms of military expenditure and manpower, Ireland absorbs more than both the war with Spain and intervention in the Netherlands combined. So it's not a sideshow, it's the main theatre of military conflict. At the end of this period, some £2 million are spent trying to crush the Irish lords, and maybe over 100,000 English are killed in the process. So that was it's such an important part of our history, and as a starting point for the English Empire, the early modern empire, and yet, so little known. So that was a really exciting flashpoint to start with, to show just how kind of resilient, and even after the Irish lords lose their political independence, Irish culture, Irish law, Irish society, and the Catholic religion survive and go on. And the English never really succeed in colonising Irish society in the way they do territory. And, the subsequent centuries are a history of resistance and rebellion all the way up to the early 20th century when Ireland achieves its independence. So, that was a really interesting story. And then I filter out from there looking at the unsuccessful colonisation of Osamocomoc, which we know as maybe the Carolina Sounds region in North America, the establishment of the colony of Roanoke, which is a really interesting earliest attempt at the English to establish colonies in North America across the Atlantic. But it's one of complete failure. There are multiple attempts to sustain a colony, but due to fierce resistance from the Algonquin people, Seneca-Moco is a kind of divided region between different indigenous people, but gradually they're able to contain the English. Only after many of the people of Seneca-Moco are killed through disease and through violence committed by the English. But eventually Sir Walter Raleigh, who's funding these expeditions, gives up. It's costing too much, and they withdraw for a good almost century, don't return back. So the failure of Roanoke, and historians sometimes obsessed with Roanoke as the lost colony. There's a story that they had to withdraw and leave over 100 colonists there, and they were never seen again, and what happened to them. But that misses the point for me. That's a really powerful story about indigenous Americans who are often reduced to being these kind of passive victims of European disease and violence and kind of being wiped out. But actually, no, Seneca-Moco is a bustling indigenous country, powerful. They've got good knowledge of Europeans and what they're up to, and they use that against the colonists. And it's a good example of how they are able to succeed against English ambition. And so, and then I look at Jamestown, and we think of Jamestown as the first successful English colony in North America from 1607. But actually I show how it takes almost a half a century for the English colonists to contest the Powhatan chiefdom, which is the main political and military power in what we call Virginia, but was known as Seneca Moco. And that there's 3 Anglo-Powhatan wars, and it's a really contested space. It's not a case of the colonists coming in and overthrowing Powhatan hegemony, and they retain that hegemony all the way through to the 1640s, when finally the chiefdom is dismantled and the Powhatan people have been decimated by war and disease and displacement. And then finally, in that first part of the book, I then look at the Caribbean. And that for me was maybe one of the most rewarding parts of the book. I spent a couple of chapters talking about the indigenous Kalinago people, for which I'll confess before writing the book I knew a little bit, but not much. And we think of the Caribbean as the kind of the beating heart of the English mercantilist empire, the plantation society based on sugar, cotton and tobacco as fueling the maritime power of England and, contributing to its great power status by the end of the 17th century. And if we think about Caribbean resistance, we think about European rivalry, control for the Caribbean sugar islands between the English and the French, or the Dutch, or the Spanish and Portuguese. But actually, the indigenous Kalinago people resist every square inch of territory which the English attempt to colonise in the Caribbean. And there's a really exciting story there of the Kalinago managing to contain English colonisation to the far north of the Eastern Caribbean. The English are focused on the Lesser Antilles, places like St. Kitts and Antigua and those sorts of islands. But that's the Kalinago heartland. And the Kalinago are a really mobile people. They use canoes as big as entire trees that could fit 40 people in, and their canoe war fleets were a power to be reckoned with. And they were able to kind of really blunt English colonisation, despite English attempts to use, really mass violence. There's hideous massacres, sometimes of 2,000. A very infamous one in 1626 on the island of St. Christopher, La Amiga as the Kalinago called it. And English conquest is consolidated through the massacre of over 2,000 Kalinago people. So colonial violence is at the forefront of the conquest. But despite that, through counter raids and by dominating at sea, the Kalinago are able to maintain the English and to hem them into the north for almost 40 years. It's not really until the 1660s, some 40 years after the first English colony is established on St. Kitts, where the English are finally able to take over large portions of the Eastern Caribbean. But there's a remarkable treaty between the Kalinago and the French and English, which is really a kind of concession by the Europeans of the power of the Kalinago people, where they're forced to partition the rest of the islands with the Kalinago. So there's a Kalinago independent territory in the late 17th century, which the English and French have conceded to respect and not to conquer. So it's a great example of, even in the heart of the emerging English empire, indigenous people were able to reshape English ambitions and to often successfully contest imperial expansion.
I asked David about what he calls the European gaze, how English and other European contemporaries viewed non-European societies, and especially their militaries.
Yeah, I think that was, for me, one of the most surprising things. I see that when I study the East India Company in Asia. Asia is the centre of the world in the pre-modern period. It's got the world's early modern superpowers, the Mughal Empire, Safavid Persia, Tokugawa Japan, and the English are operating from a place of intense weakness and vulnerability. And there are very few occasions they challenge the military might of the Mughal Empire, for example. They're essentially swatted aside and have to go back begging for forgiveness. And so I was curious about that sort of military, technological kind of benefit that the English sources suggest that they had, and their rendering of indigenous people as savages, of course, is the language most frequently used in the sources, as barbarians. And there's a fantastic East India Company source for the 1640s or 50s discussing the Indians of India and sort of saying these aren't like the savage Indians in America. And so there's this othering that happens at the Atlantic, which doesn't really come into play in Asia until the later 18th and 19th centuries, when Britain is aspiring to imperial dominance. And so what was interesting is, yes, the sources do often dismiss the power and the dynamism and the resilience of indigenous people in the Atlantic. And I think the Kalinago are a great example, one of which is that they don't call them the Kalinago. Kalinago is the term they identify themselves by. Europeans and the English call them Caribs, and dismiss them as cannibals. And they're doing this largely from Spanish sources. The Caribs were the people that Columbus and his successors could not conquer. There's almost a century of Spanish attempts to dominate the the Eastern Caribbean, but the Kalinago successfully, after about a century, fight off the Spanish and in fact take the war to the Spanish and raid the Spanish mainland and the Greater Antilles where the Spanish colonies are. So over this century of struggle, the Kalinago have developed a really sophisticated military and defensive system that's very responsive to external aggression. And so they've sort of perfected this. And so when the English come in with their, Spanish stereotypes of the indigenous people as being cannibals and savages, actually what it is that they're playing into Spanish tropes about, from a place of failure and frustration at the sophistication of the Kalinago people and their ability to defeat the Spanish. And I think that really puts the English on the back foot because, actually as they encounter the Kalinago, they realise that these are not people that you should be messing with. And what I think the great way in which the Kalinago are able to sort of subvert those English stereotypes about Kalinago society is that they often dismiss, for example, the chiefs as these small village tribal chiefs. And actually the chiefs these are elected officers, and they're responsible for foreign policy and for defence. And they're usually people that have been elected by the various villages and towns because of their reputation and their abilities, and they're able to create inter-island or intercommunal alliances that bring several communities across the various islands together to confront aggressors. And so the English often thought that the islands were totally divided and that they would land on one island and think they were dealing with the chief of this particular part of the island. But what that chief would often do is then secretly call for support from neighbouring islands and the chiefs there. And suddenly, very unawares, the English would be confronted with quite a strong coalition that would strike and contain them very early on. And so they realised that they lacked the military advantage that they had hoped. And a great example of this is there's an English shipwreck on one of the islands, St. Lucia. And St. Lucia is in the heartland of the Kalinago territory. And there's about 120 or so colonists, and they know they shouldn't be here. They know that the Kalinago are, they're very hospitable. They are very friendly, but if you outstay your welcome, if you show any signs of attempting to settle, then they quite rightly confront the colonists and attempt to expel them. And so after several weeks, the English have a plan to actually try and settle in St. Lucia, the castaways. And before you know it, within a week or so, there's an communal inter-island coalition that lands, and the English are confident in the cannon that they have managed to assemble, and their armour and their guns, obviously. But the Kalinago use poisonous arrows from the saps of a particular plant, and they're able to apply cotton to the end and set them alight, and they create an inferno in the English camp. And very quickly, many of the English are sort of going insane from the effects of the poison. The camp is an inferno. The camp's aflame. It's an inferno, and as everyone's dying around them, the Kalinago are barely able to be seen, hidden from the shoreline. And for almost 5 straight days, there's maybe a dozen or 2 dozen English who are clinging on to this cannon. It's run out of ammunition, so they're loading it with pebbles and stones and shooting at anything that comes past. And they're clinging on, but they're dying of the exposure. They're there for almost 5 days. The whole camp has been decimated. Everyone else has died, and they're swiveling the cannon this way and that way as the Kalinago essentially just hem them in. And so, and eventually they surrender, and the Kalinago put them into a boat and set them adrift, and so it's a great subversion of, you can land and have ships and cannon, but essentially this is Kalinago territory, and their relationship with the environment, their ability to use poison and to use cotton, which they trade with Europeans and actually use it as a kind of fire projectile. It's a great example of that. But no, you mentioned the canoe fleets, and there is a sort of dismissal, but it's interesting if you read the sources carefully that yes, there are those typical European othering of the Kalinago and indigenous Americans and so forth. But sometimes they just can't help but marvel at what they're encountering in the Atlantic. And you see that with the Kalinago. You can read through the source, and there are accounts, especially by French missionaries, who are completely, how are they building these 30-foot canoes that aren't just for war, they're for trade. And we think about the trade winds as dictating movement in the Atlantic, but the trade winds are not important in the Caribbean. It's the local currents, and Kalinago knowledge of currents mean that they've carved out these maritime highways where they can travel around the Caribbean in hours and most days. And so, whereas the Europeans' big ships are at the mercy of the trade winds, and that mobility allows them to trade widely and to move widely. Some islands are not settled permanently; they're used to grow certain crops, which the Kalinago travel around and utilize for part of the year. Then they'll move on to another island, and so they've created this amazing maritime ecosystem for trade, but also for war. And so these are these canoes. Sometimes it takes a whole year to carve these and to make them into the ships they are. And you see that most spectacularly when the Kalinago. We often hear about the British dividing and conquering across the world, but the Kalinago are really adept at turning the Europeans against one another and dividing the European presence and exploiting it. So the Kalinago, seeing the French as the lesser challenge to their dominion, they ally with the French by 1660 against the English. And you have this spectacular, when war breaks out in the early 1660s, the French Navy is fighting side by side with the Kalinago war fleet of about 80 canoes and 1,500 people, and maritime battles take place between the Royal Navy and the French Kalinago fleets, and so they're fighting as equals. And the English, what comes through the sources, the English are more terrified of the Kalinago fleets than they are of the French Navy, because they're more mobile and they're expert raiders, and they're able to kind of hit an island and get out of there before any kind of response can materialize. And so you get these great sources where they say it's not the French we're scared of, it's the they call them heathens, the Kalinago in their fleets of canoes. So that they fall into these mistakes of perpetrating these old Spanish stereotypes that come from a place of fear and weakness, because the Kalinago have defeated the Spanish, and they go in and so that any idea of kind of superiority, the Kalinago are very good at subverting that and using it to their own advantage. And I think you see that time and again in these. The way in which the Kalinago are really the third power in the Eastern Caribbean. It's the French, the English, and then it's the Kalinago. And their political and military power survives all the way into the 18th century.
And just to finish the story of the Kalinago, you mentioned that they come to a treaty with the French and the English and have a territory. I notice you said territory and not state. How was the issue of acknowledgement in that treaty dealt with by the English and the French, and what happened to that territory?
Yeah, it was a good question, because it's really pertinent to the story. The book focuses on these flashpoints of defiance and the success, but ultimately, we know by the end of the 18th century, the turn of the 19th century, we know the British Empire becomes dominant and successful and one of the foremost imperial powers. And so that, I tried not to write this from a kind of, from a place of that inevitability. I wanted to look at these flashpoints on their own terms. But ultimately, the 1660 treaty is such a fascinating document. You rarely see the great European powers enter into treaties which treat indigenous people in terms of their equality. And so we look at this kind of, the sources at the time often referred to it as the sort of reserve, but it's not. It's an independent Kalinago territory, and it's something that it's interesting because you're right in not identifying. There's no Kalinago state. We often try and project those kind of European ideas of the state onto indigenous polities, and the Powhatan chiefdom is a chiefdom. It's a kind of complex network of communities that are tied together through kinship and through tributary status. We often think of it as an empire or a kingdom, but it wasn't those things. So we have to understand indigenous political structures on their own terms. So when Europeans did, they often then dismissed them as quite simple. But they're very effective, and the Kalinago operate communally. So in terms of the local level, each village or community, shared the land, and there was no private property, and so it looked pretty utopian. It wasn't. There were important gender inequalities. Women did most of the domestic work, and they also did a lot of the economic work, and they produced manufacturers for trade, and they tended to crops and to commodities that would then be traded. Men tended to focus on war, and a significant amount of their time was spent on recreation. And so you've got a great French missionary accounts of the men essentially lazing around, playing the flute, daydreaming, painting themselves in red dye. The French missionaries were scandalized. These lazy people, they're coming from a very European capitalist system in which everyone pays taxes and labor is the kind of driving force in society. And they fail to recognize this, the way, this is the dream, surely, the way society should be. But, that's a too rosy a picture. As I say, it's a very, there's a lot of gender inequality and an unfair share of labor. But so these are communities very decentered. They elect chiefs that oversee war and foreign policy, but there's not much hierarchy. There are family heads that often govern several households together. But yeah, and so the communities operate very loosely and autonomously from one another, but were often able to come together so impressively in such a short amount of time. And that's something that they had developed over a century when fighting the Spanish, and were able to deploy against the English. So the way in which the English and the French have to go about creating this treaty is by calling together all of the various chiefs of the various islands. So in the end, something like 11 turn up on Guadeloupe to agree to the treaty, and we've got a list of the chiefs who were involved, which is very rare again to have the names of indigenous leaders, especially in the Caribbean. And so that's a really great document. And as I said, the terms are ones of equality. So it brings an end to the 40-year war between the Kalinago Islands and the French and the English. The French and the English promised to return Kalinago captives, and they promised not to settle in Kalinago Islands as identified by the treaty. For the Kalinago, they promised no longer to raid French and English islands, but significantly, there's no limits on where they can settle. So their independent territory is respected, but they're still free to settle beyond their own territory on various European islands. And what's interesting for me is that in some of those islands that we accept as being French or English by this time, still have significant Kalinago populations and communities on them. And so most islands tended to be unofficially partitioned. So Guadeloupe is a great example. It's the key French colony in the Caribbean. And yet, even by the end of the century, it's still partitioned. The windward side, the kind of right or eastern side, is settled by the Kalinago, and the French are contained to the leeward side, or the western portion. So they're even outside of their homeland. There's quite significant Kalinago communities elsewhere. But essentially, in some ways, that loose autonomy was the kind of downfall of the power of the Kalinago. They could come together in times of extreme kind of challenges to dispel the English or fight the French or Spanish, but there was no significant inter-island organisation or unity in a way that they could come together on a kind of more permanent basis. And so what that means is that after 1660, there are 4 more wars with the Kalinago across the next 150 years, and in each war, often the Kalinago are divided, and even on the same island. So the island of Dominica, for example, or Hueta Cabuli, as it was known to the Kalinago, the Kalinago are divided between pro-French communities on the windward side, and we can loosely term them pro-English communities on the leeward. And so the English ally with the leeward communities against the French-backed windward communities, and through that the English are able to bring Dominica under some kind of impermanent and loose control. And so this way they gradually chip away at Kalinago independence, because there's no single unified Kalinago polity. But even then, in two further wars in the 17th century essentially contained the Kalinago to just 2 or 3 key islands, St. Lucia, Dominica, and a couple of smaller islands. And this is the kind of point really by the 1676 onwards is where we can essentially suggest that the English and French are hegemonic in the Lesser Antilles in the Eastern Caribbean. But even then, it takes 2 further quite spectacular wars in the later 18th century, known as the Anglo-Carib Wars, for the Kalinago to be kind of completely expelled from the Caribbean. So at the end of the Fourth War in the 1790s, the remaining 5,000 Kalinago people of the Eastern Caribbean are deported by the British colonial authorities and sent to live on an island off the coast of Honduras. They're not the Kalinago presence kind of clings on in small enclaves and hidden kind of valleys and things, but essentially from that point onwards it is. But that's a process 175 years in the making. It's to kind of write the indigenous people off early on when sugar begins to spread and the English colonization increases is to tell a very small part of the story. We have to acknowledge that this was a long process. It rarely went how the English wanted it to go, and even at the very height of their power in the 18th century, they're still having to compromise for control of the Caribbean. So it's a very drawn out affair. And so when I argue in this book, this is maybe in some terms the age of empire when the European empires are expanding and dominating the world, but that is a 3-century period in which their expansion is contested by this constellation of very powerful polities that often very hard outside, specialist academic research to find the story of the Kalinago people in narratives of the British Empire. They're almost ignored. And so, these are the kind of small stories I wanted to bring to a wider audience and share some of the fantastic research that my colleagues working in these kind of areas are doing that, a non-specialist member of the public might not have access to or would know about. What they're particularly good at doing, I think, which makes the story even more relevant, is the fact that, yes, their numbers are decimated and they're reduced through enslavement, through war and violence and colonization and displacement. But actually, they're pretty good at sort of avoiding demographic collapse by absorbing other communities. And so a really important community, obviously a growing one in the 17th century, is those of enslaved African people who are brought over in their hundreds and thousands in the later 17th century to work on sugar plantations, is that many of them run away. And these, we refer to them as maroon communities of runaway enslaved people. They find refuge and shelter amongst the Kalinago. And so we have this kind of the Kalinago numbers becoming decimated, but rebounding slightly as they absorb runaway enslaved people. And so the more runaway slaves there are, the kind of, and so there are, maybe in the 1670s, maybe a military strength of 1,500 Kalinago people, and possibly about 40% of those are maroons, are runaway enslaved people who are intermarry or intermingle and integrate into Kalinago society, or some of them set up autonomous communities that ally with the Kalinago. So that's just another example of the way they're able to use the kind of slavery and plantation society against the English. And in the Kalinago raids, where they attack English colonies and islands, the part of it is to acquire loot and capture the English. But one of the other things they do is they liberate enslaved people, a considerable number, who are integrated into Kalinago society. So for me, ignoring this story is ignoring a big piece of the puzzle of understanding about English colonialism in places like the Caribbean.
And again, to talk about just the way that the Europeans viewed the cultures they were engaging with. One of the things I really enjoy about the way you write The Great Defiance is you're very clear where the contemporaries, especially the contemporary English, are probably misunderstanding their situation. There's a fantastic bit where you talk about, but John Smith is taken captive and he's paraded around the Powhatan territories and shown off to all these communities. And he's seeing this as a grand tour of, respect or something like that. And you point out that no, it's much akin to a victory parade. look at these strange foreigners who have rocked upon our shores and are causing a problem. We can beat them. And yet he reports back that, oh yes, I was shown all these honors and feasted and stuff. It's like, no, this is a triumph. You're a prisoner in a triumph.
That's just a really good example of the fact that there's a longer history here before the English arrive. And so, one of the things when you shed light on English colonialism, especially violence and slavery, often the response, especially from people perhaps who aren't specialists, is but it wasn't just the English, it was the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the Dutch, and that's absolutely true, of course. I don't think that does anything to change the fact that the English are doing it, but it is true that the English are coming in often on the kind of coattails of other Europeans. And so by the time the English arrive in places like Japan as well, which they attracted to through Portuguese and Dutch accounts, but especially North America, where they're really relying on Portuguese maps and Portuguese and Spanish written accounts which are published in Europe, that they go in with it's very, I guess, Eurocentric, very kind of very sort of othered view of these people, and there's a particular emphasis on I've mentioned sort of the European gaze, but you could also call it whiteness, of course, and is that they there's a great account from Osamocomox, South Carolina, well, the Carolinas, I guess what you would call it, is that when they try and establish the Roanoke colonies, this chap Arthur Barlow is writing that the indigenous people seemed to be amazed by my skin and by our European appearance and all of this sort of thing, and he's writing but actually what he doesn't realise is that they're not amazed, is that they've got a long history with dealing with Europeans, and the English feel like they are this kind of unique race, and that the indigenous people are kind of in awe. But actually, before the English arrive in the 1580s, they've been dealing with French and Spanish and Portuguese trade and colonists, and they have successfully expelled European colonies before. And some indigenous Algonquin people have been to Europe and have come back, and so know quite a lot about European society. And therefore they know what to expect. And two Algonquins go back with one of these fleets funded by Sir Walter Raleigh, and they go back to England. They're dispatched by the chief of Roanoke, and he wants to understand a bit about these people who he's kind of let in. He wants to trade with them. They bring metal goods and things like that, and so there could be an advantage. There could be a benefit to him. And he sends these two Algonquin people back, and they come back, and one of them is very kind of glamoured by England and thinks it's marvellous, and that the future of the Roanoke people should be to ally with these powerful people with their stone cities with many thousands. And the other one is completely aghast and realises that the English they're people to be feared, and that Roanoke will be swallowed up if they don't defend themselves. And so there's a great articulation amongst the Algonquin people about who these Europeans are, and it's less from a place of, my gosh, look at them, and more from a place of sizing them up and generally getting a good kind of idea about who they are and what they want. And so very quickly do the Algonquin rulers in Seneca Moco sort of turn on the English, and realizing that if they don't oppose them or resist them, then there's trouble ahead. And the same, you got a great example of John Smith in Virginia, or what would be called Seneca Moco. He's captured by Opachancanough, who's the brother of Wahun Sanako, the paramount chief, and he orders him to go out and find this John Smith. They've recently landed. John Smith is leading expeditions up the James River to reconnoitre the area. Is this a suitable colony for the English? And Wahun Sanako wants him contained and wants him under control. So he sends his brother out, who captures him. And yes, and part of Algonquin, cultural norms are about respect and about hospitality, mostly about exchange of gift giving. And so they treat John Smith very well, and they feast him and host him. Someone tries to assassinate him, the father of one of the Powhatan warriors who John Smith manages to shoot as he's being attacked. But other than that, it's a pleasant experience for John Smith. But absolutely, this is a way, he doesn't realise he's been taken 20-25 miles around the chiefdom, paraded, because the Powhatans know who these Europeans are, and they want to prove, as you said, that the Powhatans are more than a match for them. And so it reassures many of the tribes. The Powhatan A paramount chiefdom is a kind of sort of semi-loose affiliation brought under the rule of Wahunsanaka, and the tribes furthest away from Wahunsanaka's seat of power are more autonomous, and therefore it's a way to strengthen the bonds of the various tribes. And John Smith unwittingly plays that part brilliantly. And so I think that underestimation, but that's not unique to the Atlantic. The English take that out to Asia as well. And places like Japan, for example, where they arrive in Japan 1611, really much of what they know about Japan comes from Portuguese and Dutch accounts that show this country that's embroiled in 150 years of the Sengoku period of the warring daimyo and the warring Japanese lords, and it's a very politically fractured and turbulent. And, that's great news for Europeans who the Portuguese especially have been able to use that turbulence and insert themselves into Japanese trading systems and have established themselves in Kyushu and the southernmost island of Japan, spread their religion. There's something like 300,000 Catholic converts. And have able to gain a kind of semi-monopoly on the trade routes between Japan and China, and the Portuguese have made themselves very dominant in southern Japan and very wealthy. So the English come in with these kind of very misguided ideas about the society and the political environment that they're entering. And that lack of knowledge, or certainly less relevant knowledge now, that possibly, that's not a good description of Japan ever. But that made some sense 20 years ago. But by the time the English arrive in Japan in 1611, there's a new shogun Ieyasu. His Tokugawa shogunate has centralized power. He's created a strong, expansive bureaucracy, the kind of state that makes the bureaucracy and states in Europe at the time look amateur. Whitehall had something like 1,200 kind of part-time, slightly kind of amateurish officials. The Bakufu, the military government of Japan under the Tokugawa shoguns, has extensive hundreds of thousands of officials running state departments that regulate trade, religion, everything, foreign relations, and the spectacular centralization of power upon the shogun himself. The English just don't understand where power lies. They still think it lies with the independent daimyos who have kind of taken over parts of Japan and run it like their private fiefdoms. That's not the case anymore. The shogun has reduced the daimyos more like to kind of like to be dependent upon the court in Edo. And so power and trade has shifted away from the provinces and centered on the court of the shogun. And the English just don't know this. And they spend 15 years messing around in Hirado, which is basically a fishing hamlet 700 miles away from the center of power, which you need access to. Under the new shoguns, to trade in Japan and succeed, you have to participate in what's known as the Red Seal system, where you have to gain a license from the shogun, stamped with his Red Seal stamp, his seal of authority, and only then can you officially participate in trade. And it takes them years to figure this out, and they waste all of their money and time messing around on the fringes of Japan until they finally learn you need political capital, access to court, a relationship with the shogun, understand the very complex Bakufu bureaucracy. And by the time they figure this out, they're far behind the other Europeans, and so they're always on the back foot because of it. And ultimately they fail in Japan, mostly because Japan itself turns against the Europeans. It seems their presence is very corrosive and undermines Japanese sovereignty, and gradually all the Europeans are expelled except the Dutch. But and so that could be very costly. And if you look at a map of the British Empire at the end of the 18th century, you think, wow, how successful. But if you look at East Asia, which was an intense focus of the East India Company earlier on, there's no imperial pink, not because the English weren't interested, because they failed miserably. China, Japan, Southeast Asia are all shut to the English through their failures and their mistakes, and the power of the societies and the states that they encounter there. And so, but in some areas, they gradually learn from those mistakes, and they gradually are able to tap themselves into local systems of knowledge and trade. And that's process takes several decades. But in places like India, they do eventually manage to master that, and they become an important cog in the wider circuits of trade and knowledge and exchange. And so, yes, that could often be fatal, as in North America. it can often lead to big disappointment, as in East Asia. And sometimes they're eventually able to get their act together and learn from their kind of fatal misunderstandings of the non-European people they encounter.
The Great Defiance only goes up to a certain point, but I think your argument that the British Empire is just a lot of the time fitting to the spaces and the crags it can get hold of and growing from there, that seems to play out for me. I mean, obviously my focus, my specialism is 20th century, and the British Empire by the First World War is just a hodgepodge made out of necessity, and there's no idea of overall a uniform style of imperial expansion. It's just, it makes perfect sense that didn't come out of nothing. That is the way it's always been, almost.
Yeah, and I think that talks mostly to the fact that not necessarily that the British were not concerned with creating some kind of unity, some kind of overarching governance, and I think they were, and I think they spent a lot of time, and there's some great historians that have written about this attempt to impose some kind of order, which itself is a kind of colonial project and justification for empire. I think, in fact, it speaks far more to the fact that it's the local context that the British were operating in that generally determined the outcome of their presence there. And I think it's the resilience and strength of the non-European indigenous people they meant that whether they were successful and how dominant they were really depended on those particular flashpoints of resistance and how the English and later the British were able to overcome them. So I think you're absolutely right. We've got this kind of patchwork, this kind of Hobbesian nightmare of this slightly kind of cranky structure that is different. British rule in India is very different to colonies in North America, and I think that's because it's those local encounters and the different people and the different states and cultures that the English and British encounter. They're the determining factor. That's the overriding force which shapes British expansion. And so, in a way, we've kind of forgotten that, it's not centrifugal. The British Empire, there are certain times when it can be centrifugal, when the forces emanating from Europe and from Britain and London can have a decisive impact or intervention in certain regions of the world. That can happen. There are obvious examples of that happening. But I think generally the patterns of the development, the way the British Empire develops and expands and retreats and the shapes it takes and the local power structures are essentially determined by the people it encounters. They have an agency over the expansion of the British Empire in a way that I think we don't always accept. And that's not obviously to make the silly argument that they were partners in empire. I think that suggests collaboration. And while obviously we know local elites did often, to quite a big extent, collaborate with British imperialism and colonialism, especially places in India. Actually, I think what we're talking about is really the power of indigenous and non-European people over the British, and the fact that the British had to constantly accommodate their interests and their power. And so it wasn't a case of coming in and flattening indigenous and non-European states and societies and refashioning them and controlling them. What the British end up ruling is, this compromise between indigenous and non-European power and what the British actually wanted. And so had they had their way, then they would have been in China and Japan, and they would have dominated the Indonesia and the Spice Islands, and it wouldn't have taken them 150 years to colonize all of the Caribbean and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, yes, you're absolutely right. It's this kind of ramshackle patchwork. It's very different depending on where you are, and I think that tells us a lot about this kind of the sheet of steel that is the British Empire has been kind of hammered, and indigenous power has left this kind of far more ragged contours, these kind of like you said, crevices and niches, and that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at necessarily the success of the British when we look at a map of the empire. We're looking at its kind of often fatal compromises. And the survival of indigenous and non-European people, and often, if not their political independence, then certainly their cultural and social power. And so we're not necessarily always thinking, I think, about it in the right way.
When we last talked on the podcast back in 2021, we were talking about this book that you were working on at the time. And at the time, your working title was The Mirage of Empire, A New History of the World at the Dawn of British Expansion. Now, obviously, titles change for all sorts of reasons, but I'm curious, does the change in title, from The Mirage of Empire to The Great Defiance, does that reflect a change in focus for the book, or did changing the title lead to a different book hitting the shelves, or another way, is The Great Defiance the same book you thought The Mirage of Empire was going to be? And if not, what's different?
That's such a good question. Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. Yes, I think the research and the writing of the book changed what the book ended up being, and I think all good research and writing should do that. You have an idea of where you're going. Obviously, you have a hypothesis, and I pitched the book to Penguin and sold the book to Penguin on this Mirage of Empire. This idea that we can't. It's difficult to understand what the states and societies were like in the pre-modern world, because a lot of the history that's come down to us have been distorted by this kind of the pen of the colonizer and the histories, the kind of 20th century histories that often British colonialists and imperialists and officials had actually written about the places that they were ruling or governing. And so I wanted to write a history that had to kind of get through this mirage, this kind of propagandistic imperial veil that covered these histories. And obviously they had a interest in dismissing the power of indigenous and non-European societies. Part of the colonial process isn't about obviously reducing those people to othering them, to being backward or violent or cruel, and somehow justifying white imperial rule, the white man's burden, as Kipling said in the later 19th century. And so that process leads to a body of scholarship that we see that influence all the way down to the 20th, early 21st century. Books like I'll pick a fight here, Niall Ferguson's How Britain Made the World, and it's just this idea that that's such a colonial regurgitation of Victorian imperial histories of the places that Britain was occupying. And so I wanted to kind of pull that and show that these were actually successful. Yes, they're ultimately 300 years later conquered or colonized, but on their own terms at the time, they're examples of very successful, sophisticated, dynamic, powerful cultures, economies, and political structures, and that we shouldn't dismiss them as passive victims of English or British success. And that was the book I kind of thought about. So looking at the ways in which, focusing more about the stories and the histories of these places, and so that element has obviously stayed an important part of the book. But when I started researching it back when we spoke, it became less about that mirage, although it still is about that, the way that it's clouded the actual view of these places and people and their history. It became more antagonistic because the sources were just, in a way I was coming from studying the British in Asia, in which they have to accommodate to their surroundings because the East India Company is weak. Most of the Europeans are. And, they're operating amongst, as I said earlier, the pre-modern world superpowers. The Mughal Empire, ruled 125 million people, 20% of the world's GDP. It's the center of cultural and scientific and of learning and knowledge, and so violence was obviously part of the equation. The English often tried to get what they wanted through violence, but when that failed, and it almost always did, they had to then reconcile and find a way to adapt and play by the rules that were written by non-Europeans. And so, but as I was widening this, as I said at the beginning of this talk, taking that idea of the power of non-European people and looking at the Atlantic, and I look at the Mediterranean, I look at West Africa, it became a far more antagonistic story. There's just more violence and there's more resistance. We could cast the relationship between the British and the Mughal Empire as one of resistance in a way, but the Mughal Empire were operating from a position of power and strength. So it's not so much resistance as it is, just swatting the English away and saying, don't be silly. And the English coming back on their hands and knees. But it is more how it would describe resistance between, if you take somewhere like the Caribbean, or even, Virginia, Seneca-Moco, there's 15,000 people in the Powhatan chiefdom. By the end of the 17th century, there's maybe 250,000 European colonists living on the eastern seaboard, 40,000 colonists crammed into the Caribbean islands, and by the end of the 17th, early 18th century, there's maybe 5,000 Kalinago people. So this tsunami of both forced and free migration and labour does, to an extent, lead to what we would term resistance, and so that. So the story became more antagonistic. It became more, and I saw also about, I obviously study Mughal history, the British Empire in Asia, but, in this book, placing it into that more global context and making the story across a much longer period. the way in which the Mughal Empire itself dissolves through, not necessarily through the Britain's expansion, but more because the Marathas, this Hindu empire in central India, in the Deccan, usurps and eventually gobbles up the Mughal Empire, and it's really the Marathas who take on the British at the end of the 18th century for hegemony over the Indian subcontinent. And that became a story, again, of defiance and resistance. And so researching and writing the book did change it, less of a kind of excavation of cultures and states that maybe we don't know too much about, or what we know about them has been skewed by the way British colonists wrote about them and how historians use those sources very uncritically and regurgitated this idea that Britain came in, steamrolled and refashioned the world in its image. That element is still there, but it's within a story of antagonism and resistance, where violence was really at the heart of this. And so, even the Mughal Empire, that was, this unfathomable military power, repeatedly in Eastern and Western India, the East India Company do go to war with the Mughal Empire, and they do try and achieve what they want: commercial monopoly, territorial jurisdictions, at the point of a gun. And so I do then tease and bring to the fore these points of violence and military conflict, in a way that perhaps I hadn't before, and in a way we tend not to for Asia. And so then there was a more cohesive story of global resistance to British ambition, tied together with, still with this idea from when it was in its mirage phase, that it was the resilience and power of indigenous and non-European people, which was really the remarkable story for this period, not the inevitable success of the English or the French or the Dutch, but actually that this constellation of states and cultures so different. Perhaps there's never been, such a diverse range of political, economic and cultural systems and structures than there was in those 3 centuries, from the 16th to the end of the 18th century. And the various ways in which they were able to defy British ambition, and those who were caught in the crosshairs of English colonialism. That was the story, I think, that came through the sources the most. And I think so, by placing the story of the British in Asia and contextualizing that with what was going on elsewhere in the world, it did become more of a story of antagonism and resistance than I thought it would be. And I think that's a more important story at the moment, especially when there is a concerted effort for not necessarily historians, they tend to often be economists or theologians, who are maybe better at occupying the public conversation about the British Empire than actual historians have been so far. And so I thought that this was an opportunity to enter that conversation, this absurd balance sheet approach of that these people tend to adopt, that, yes, the British Empire, famine, all bad, but hey, cricket, so that's not bad. Think about the railways. And I think if you take a longer history of the British Empire, because often people think, it starts with Queen Victoria and there's a saturation of modern histories. One thing I did as I was writing is I did wander around. I live in Sussex, in the south coast of England. I wandered around quite a few bookshops just to kind of see what was the kind of state of histories of the British Empire for a wider public audience. And, it's all 19th and 20th century. Not to say that's not a fantastic period to work on, absolutely not. But I think there's a skewed or a neglect of a much longer and richer history that complicates this idea of the British Empire as maybe a force for good, or as something that was good and bad. And, there's no railways in the 16th, 17th century. The British Empire that emerges is a structure of coercion and exploitation. It's economically and commercially mercantilist. It's about dominating resources, exploiting the land, displacing indigenous and non-European people. It's based overwhelmingly on the enslavement of millions of people from Western Central Africa. There's no civilizing project that a certain kind of person might cling on to justify it. And so it is a far more, the early modern history of the British Empire, I think, serves to undermine what I think is a very flawed approach to understanding the British Empire. Was it good or was it bad? Well, empires are structures of coercion and control, and that's the starting point we need to take. And so inevitably its encounter with anyone in the world was based upon assertion of authority and power. And that naturally lends itself to resistance and defiance to varying degrees of success. So yeah, absolutely. I think I think that a project maybe it's like as ambitious as this had it not changed or shifted. And I think all good books should change through the research process, because as I say, you go in thinking, you have a hypothesis, but really your sources, if you're working with sources you've not worked before, which I'll say a lot of new sources for me, then they should change your ideas in your story. And so I didn't go into this thinking I would be writing a story that was as violent and antagonistic as this one turned out to be. So absolutely a big shift. And I think that title, The Great Defiance, may have had some editorial assistance with that one, but I think it absolutely fits the wider narrative that the book ends up writing. I think that even when I look at places like the Mediterranean or West Africa is a good example of where there's not necessarily resistance in the terms of indigenous people fighting the British in defence of their country or their societies. The kind of defiance West African states offer the British is they defy their expectations for the trade in enslaved people. And so I spent a chapter writing about quite a well-known kingdom to specialists, but not necessarily to non-specialists, is the kingdom of Dahomey, which is a state in West Africa, who's goes on to conquer the ports on the coast, who are some of the most important in plying the trade in enslaved Africans. And the English have managed to make themselves master of these ports and dominate the trade in enslaved people. But Dahomey defies those expectations for English monopoly by asserting its own control over the trade and by forcing British merchants to play by Dahomeyan rules. And they try and make Dahomey the beneficiary of the slave trade, not the British merchants. Now, that's not a inspiring story of resistance. That's a terrible story. It's just that we often think of the British as becoming hegemonic and their ambitions being realised everywhere. The story of Dahomey shows that no, their ambitions were regularly defied and they were left frustrated. And because of Dahomeyan control of the trade in enslaved people by the mid-18th century, the Royal African Company collapses because they demand so much money for enslaved people, and they demand a monopoly over certain goods. And so it's an example of the shifting power relationships. We always think it's with the Europeans, but a good example of Dahomey, for example, no, it is that power is often in the hands of indigenous and non-European people, and they could defy British expectations through that. So it is a story of resistance, but generally I thought defiance was a better way to describe the frustration of British aims in the world at the time.
That was a fantastic answer. So what would you say to people listening who you obviously, Great Defiance is a lot of it is written from the perspective of the peoples that the British and the English interacted with. And in that context, the British are usually, antagonistic. How would you respond to someone who's listening to this, thinks, oh, this is a great book, this sounds fantastic, but this guy is clearly just talking Britain down? Because that is, as you're well aware, common debating point here in the UK at the moment, and it's one you're aware of.
It's, I think, an important question. I mean, there is a sense to immediately dismiss it as, well, that's silly. But I think it's become an important question. I don't think it's so easily dismissed. I think part of it is a disconnect. And this is probably one of the main reasons I wrote this book, is there's a real disconnect between the wonderful, fruitful research and scholarship on the British Empire that's been done over the past 30, 40 years in Britain, and but also most especially in those countries that were once maybe part of the British Empire but are no longer now. We see that kind of post-colonial scholarship giving us a history of the British Empire from people that are no longer under British rule, and that obviously immediately shifted our perspective. And post-colonial scholarship, we all own a massive debt to it. And so I think, and more recently with global history and attempting to take a kind of wider comparative picture, all these rich seams of research that people have been pursuing. Now, there's a natural disconnect between, and I don't think historians have been good, and I think we've got a lot to do on this score. I think scientists, for example, have been great at taking their specialist research and disseminating it for a wider audience in a way which helps to bring the public conversation around science maybe in better conversation with the research that's being done in universities and elsewhere. I don't think historians have been great at this, and as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of that ground, because of that, has been occupied by people who aren't really historians. And, in a way, history belongs to all of us. History feeds into our identity and how we understand our place in the world and our place in relation to other cultures and people. And so it owes itself naturally to a great deal of controversy and politicization. And it's highly contested, as every history should be. History should be highly contested. Of course it should be. And I think that, therefore, naturally has led to the sort of lag between what's going on academically and what's going on in the public, so for people not understand that the questions that this book asks and tries to answer, and the kinds of questions and critical thinking that may provoke a non-specialist to say, well, you're just doing Britain down, we should be proud of our history. I think that's a natural result of us not having done enough of a good job to educate people. And so they see this as a new, fad and, a part of a larger, some kind of political project to do Britain down. But, this research, I don't think the big achievement in this book is to bring, it is based on archival research and primary research mostly, but I do bring a lot of the work of my colleagues and the specialists who are, better, far more specialists than I am on some of these key subjects, but I've brought them under one roof and hopefully create a kind of cohesive narrative. But none of this is new, really. And historians have been talking about, we've moved away from a British or Eurocentric perspective of the world, and we've brought enslaved people and women and the colonized into our narratives and histories of the British Empire for decades now. None of this is new. And so I think historians often get frustrated and dismiss the question because it just seems so obvious that good history does not seek to do things down or to do things up. Good history is critical. And I think that those people that see critical thinking about our past as a danger or a threat, yes, I think that's that's anti-intellectual, that's bad faith way to approach it. But I do think that comes from a point of lack of education on this topic. I think that we have to do a better job of taking our specialist research and educating the public about it in accessible histories that can be consumed, hopefully like the Great Defiance, that might provoke people to say, well, actually, I hadn't thought of it like that. And that saying, yes, that Britain was violent and that the people that violence was aimed at could often resist quite successfully isn't doing Britain down. That's just historical scholarship. That's thinking critically about the relationship between Britain and the rest of the world. And so I think that partly this is a failing of historians, and I think that more of us need to embrace writing for wider audiences. And I think academic scholarship should do that anyway. But I think that we almost have a obligation to wade into this kind of contested conversation about empire. And I think that this is a great time to do it because I think contemporary landscape and thinking about some of the big social issues of the day, such as race and legacies of imperialism and these sorts of things, global inequality. I think that grappling critically with the legacies of empire and how we regard our imperial history, this is begging for historians to wade in and help educate the wider audience. So, a good example of a contested aspect of that is, the Churchill and the reputation of Churchill. And that's become, certain scholars have fallen afoul of a wider public crowd who will not have Churchill's name besmirched. Now, that's anti-intellectual because, if you're really interested in a figure like Churchill, you have to understand that he had a role in the Second World War, for example, which if you want to view history through the lens of good and bad, you could celebrate. But you also have to place him within his longer history as an actor of the imperial project and the British Empire, and the fact that part of victory in the Second World War was in preserving the British Empire and maintaining British rule over 400 million people, and understanding that Winston Churchill was part of that. So I think that good history is critical and it disabuses us of notions of good and bad. And I do somewhat laugh at people who suggest that we should not approach this through morality and then write a book about the moral reckoning and trying to show how good the British Empire was. And so I would urge my colleagues and I will carry on following those colleagues of mine who have waded into this and provided good scholarship that has a long history and makes it more accessible to people. Hopefully over time, more people will be educated and be willing to understand that the British Empire was this structure of control and coercion. Empires are not people don't participate in empires consensually. It's not, hey, do you want to join our empire and be governed by us? Obviously that's not the case. But one of the things I hope the book does is it shows people that the British obviously were not the only ones doing it. It looks at the African role in the trade in enslaved people and the way the Kingdom of Dahomey benefited from that. It looks at Spanish and Portuguese colonialism in the Americas and the way the English tried to emulate that and follow from that. It looks at Portuguese colonization in the Indian Ocean and the way the English had to kind of contest and struggle against them. And so it's not, it does place English imperial ambitions in that wider European context. But, I'm a historian of the British Empire. And whilst I can note that other empires were engaged in this sort of thing, ultimately I'm not a historian of 10 different empires. And this is a book about, its organising focus is the British Empire. And I don't think just because other people were engaged in this trade in enslaved people that we shouldn't talk about Britain's role. And the fact is, you also can't have it both ways. Britain did emerge by the end of the 18th century as the dominant imperial power. And whilst others were involved in the trade in enslaved people, for example, Britain became the leading trafficker of enslaved people, 3.5 million in the 18th century. And so Britain often took what was already there, but grew it on a sort of industrial scale. Colonisation, the scale of colonisation for English colonies was just off the charts, and the scale of territorial acquisitions on the Indian subcontinent no other European had achieved before. So in a way, you can't accept that Britain was all dominant and hegemonic, and then suggest that it didn't achieve these things through violence or coercion and control. So I would urge anyone who might shy away from this book not to, because I like money and I want you to buy it, but also to keep an open mind that any aspect of Britain's imperial past we have to look at critically, and we have to understand it critically. And I think that I don't try and remove Britain from this story. I try and integrate other really interesting aspects that might change the way we view not just the history of Britain, because history is not nationalist. It doesn't stop at borders. It's the history of the early modern world in this period. And while I by no means claim to look at the entire world, there are at least a dozen countries and cultures that I look at and study, and I like to think that this is about making a more comprehensive story about Britain's imperial past and the history of the world before the modern period.
Well, that is a fantastic answer to finish off on. So we might as well let people know how they can get a hold of a copy of The Great Defiance, which, just to make it very clear, it's fantastic. So where can people get it from, David?
Thanks. Yep, all good bookshops. By Penguin's imprint Ebury. You can find it online. Blackwell's, Foyles, Amazon. I think there's a promotion right now, 20% off. I think it's £20. All good independent bookshops, and some of the other chains, Waterstones. If you're international, then Penguin India are printing it. But if you're in the States, for example, then you can go through some of the UK shippers like Foyles, who are pretty good at exporting to the States as well.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Veevers. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope
Thank you to Dr. David Veevers
for speaking
Thank
to me.
you so much. Thanks, Sam.
There will be a link in the episode description to its page on Penguin. I heartily recommend it. It's really engaging, it's really well written, and if you're a long-time listener, I'm convinced you'll appreciate getting another perspective on the early stages of English colonisation. I really wish I'd had a copy when I was writing those episodes, but at least I'll have it to hand for the future. Remember that you can go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to get the podcast ad-free, as well as some bonus content. Thanks once again to Dr. Veevers, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.